We've gone from just a newspaper landing on the front porch to online alerts and tweets on smartphones. Will today's new media kill off old media, or can it evolve and survive? Stay with us for Metro Center Outlook.
This program is made possible by funding from the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies, where government leaders, business executives, and academic experts come together to discuss major issues facing the state of Florida.
Hello everyone. Welcome to UCF Metro Center Outlook. I'm Diane Trees, Director of the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies. In just a moment, we'll talk with Paul Tash, CEO and Chairman of Times Publishing Company, about the economics and evolution of the newspaper industry. But first, let's get some insight into how people get their news. Here's Alicia Callanan-Mandigo.
We live in a world of instantaneous information that's coming from all directions. With so many options at hand, how are people choosing to get their news these days?
Honestly, I get mine through my fiance because he's addicted to the news and he watches it on TV and on his phone and on his iPad, all of them.
I go to news websites.
Mostly my app, my iPhone. They have a CNN app and that works out great because it gives you the top stories and basically everything you want to hear, read about.
If the internet is what you'd expect to hear all day long, then this might surprise you.
I'm a paper reader, and I also have the computer, and I pull newspapers up across the country that I want to read certain items on. But I'm the old type like has one in the hand.
I still subscribe to the Orlando Sentinel, so I get it that way. I get it through the internet, basically those two ways.
The Orlando Sentinel, it gets delivered to the house each morning.
The Wall Street Journal and CNBC.
I get it by Orlando Sentinel. And then I come over here for the fellowship and the good coffee.
There are still plenty of people reading papers. Television news viewers are still out there too.
I usually watch CNBC in the mornings and NPR in the weekends.
Mostly I watch Fox News, and also I go online and I read Drudge.
Either internet or the Deutsche Welle on television.
Well, I'm wearing my UCF gold here, and I basically turn on UCF TV. That's how I get the news.
We suspect someone here may have set us up to talk to a ringer. Okay then, on to radio. Only one radio outlet was mentioned by the people we talked to, and everyone we spoke to was getting their news by combining the internet with some sort of traditional news delivery.
Mainly through the New York Times. I read the New York Times every morning, and NPR radio. I watch television, CNBC. And NBC Nightly News. So that's basically how I get it.
I like either the internet or PBS.
For media outlets, it may be a little confusing these days on how best to deliver the news. But for consumers, it's not confusing at all. On a very individual level, they seem to know exactly how they want to get their information. Alicia Callanan-Mandigo for Metro Center Outlook.
So what is the future of news publishing? Paul Tash is not only CEO and Chairman of Times Publishing Company. As the editor for the St. Petersburg Times, Tash oversees a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper, considered among the nation's best and one of the top 25 by circulation. Paul, thank you for being my guest today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It seems a lot of times that headlines are more sensational or on scandals, not so much focused on what's happening with government or community issues. What makes news today?
Well, I think a variety of things make news, Diane, and you have to try to respond to readers at all their different interests. Yes, scandal does attract readers, and it's natural that people would be interested in it. But I also think that newspapers in particular, all media, but especially newspapers, do still the lion's share of the work in covering government and holding power to account.
How do you see the role of the newspaper changing over the next 5 years or so?
It's a very interesting time, and the future is probably more uncertain now, and things are more up in the air than they have been certainly in my lifetime. But I think that the central role of newspapers will remain pretty consistent over the next 5 years. I think there will be some consolidation in newspapers, just as there has been in other kinds of business. I think that newspapers will have to consider how they do business and become more efficient in how they do business and reduce some costs. We've certainly had a lot of that going on. But I think over the next 5 years, newspapers will continue to look for new sources of revenue. I think they will continue to cover their local communities. And in fact, if anything, there may be a little greater emphasis on covering local news and local communities as one of the things that newspapers do distinctively.
Do you think with the disillusionment that's abounding with politics and the government, to what extent do you see the American people wanting still to be engaged in getting the news? And that's in any medium.
Right. Well, I think journalism is a growth business. I think there's so much of it going on and being practiced in all kinds of new ways that in itself is an indication that people still are interested in news and want to participate in their communities. I'm from the Midwest originally. I'm an optimist by nature. I believe that people will want to remain active and engaged in their communities, and I think keeping up with news and being informed about what's going on in your community is absolutely vital to that role. So I remain an optimist.
What's the major contribution that you see that the St. Pete Times brings to the community?
I think we do a lot of things. We do support for community events. We still do a good deal of philanthropy. But the #1 contribution that the St. Petersburg Times makes to our cities, our region, the Tampa Bay region, and our state is to check up on what's going on, check up on what powerful institutions are doing. That starts with government, but it's not only government. And to, as I said a minute ago, try to hold power to account. And you benefit from that as a resident of Florida or Tampa Bay or one of our cities, whether you read the newspaper or not, because it is a huge public service that a good newspaper can provide, because institutions know that someone is watching.
Why, one of your editors recently said that investigative journalism was still a central mission for the paper. And with that watchdog role, how important that is. But with resources being more and more scarce, how do you balance the daily news stories that you need to put out with an investigative series, which has got to cost a lot more to put forth?
Indeed it does. Some of the investigative pieces that we do can take months, sometimes almost as much as a year to do. And we're working on a couple of those pieces right now. And they come at enormous cost.
Have they started or published? Or?
They haven't started quite yet. But they come at enormous cost in terms of time and effort and resource. But that's still part of what we do. And it is a balance, and the balances get tougher and tougher in a tough economy like this one. Newspapers, all news organizations, all news media are going through the same kind of struggles that the rest of the world is going through. Other kinds of businesses are going through. And so it is a tough balance these days. It's not as easy as it used to be, but we think that it's still something that makes the St. Pete Times stand apart, is that we will take on these important questions and devote some serious resources and some real talent to covering and uncovering things that need to be told.
You talked about revenue declining. Not only do you have the impact of the web and other technology, but with the recession the way it is, what do you think of the revenue model? Where can newspapers move with advertising has always been the main source, and now you can advertise anywhere. Is there another model that you're working towards?
Well, you've hit exactly on what is the central challenge these days, and that is the advertising part of the equation. Advertising typically has represented somewhere between 75 and 80% of newspaper revenue, and that has dropped sharply in the last 5 years. In fact, in the last 5 years, American newspapers as a group have seen their advertising revenues decline by half, by 50%. And how much of that is a shift toward new ways for sellers to reach buyers digitally, Craigslist in shorthand, and how much of that is just the recession is the $64 question. So if to the extent it's the recession, some of it will come back, but meanwhile we are searching for other new revenue sources and other new advertising vehicles.
Well, I saw that a lot of the major media companies are actually looking for diversification, and their holdings go far beyond just a newspaper. Is that a strategy for the future that you think is essential to survive?
Well, our big bet is still on journalism and on the business of journalism. Yes, some of the diversification has worked out brilliantly. Don Graham and the Washington Post Company hit a home run with their acquisition of Kaplan, at least so far. But sometimes diversification, if you pick the wrong new product, you can lose money as quickly as make it. And we still think that there is a great business long term in journalism, especially once we get through this punishing recession.
So you're not necessarily using that as a major strategy for the St. Pete Times at this point?
No, we are not. We have other products. They are all journalism products. We have Florida Trend magazine. We publish, 6 years ago, we started a new newspaper called the Tampa Bay Times, which is a free now daily tabloid. Which is one of the most successful and fastest growing newspapers in America at a time when people say that the future of print is in question. But so we do have these other products, but we still believe that there will be a strong future for a good metropolitan newspaper like ours.
One of the articles I read said that a major marketing tool is for the newspaper to be out in the community, whether it's sponsoring, hosting, different kinds of events. And again, that's a non-traditional role from the usual printed paper. Is that a strategy that you follow for the St. Pete Times?
We do a lot of community events, and some of them are very local and some of them are more high profile. I think, though, it's not really all that different from the central role of a newspaper in a community, which is to be the convener, which is to be an advocate for a community, which is to help people understand what's going on. So, yes, we do rather a lot of that. But I think it is also consistent with our role as a force for good within our towns.
With the impact that digital products and the web has made on publishing in the media, what do you see as the long-term effect for digital products on a newspaper?
Well, first off, we are digital. The internet is us. Much of the information, much of the content that is going onto the web is coming from news organizations like ours, and in fact our audience is far bigger and far more far-flung than it has ever been, because we are telling stories not only with ink on paper but with electrons on screens. And so we can reach people not only around Florida but around the world with the St. Petersburg Times in ways that we never could before, and the internet is bringing many, many, many more readers to our work. So I think it'll be huge. It is already hugely important and will become so. The real puzzle, though, Diane, is going to be the advertising model on the internet, and we're not anywhere near as far along at solving that puzzle as we are in attracting the readers and the viewers for our work.
Do you see in the future that digital delivery may overshadow or even eliminate print delivery?
My guess is, and I say this to our own folks, while digital is going to become steadily more important, I think we're going to be putting ink on paper for the rest of my working life and probably for the rest of my life. The media habits of people are pretty well established by the time they hit 40 years old, and there are a lot of us baby boomers who strongly prefer print.
I still need to have print.
I would also say the new newspaper that we publish, the Tampa Bay Times, which is edited and published for a younger audience, has been enormously successful with younger readers. The average age of a reader at the Tampa Bay Times is significantly younger than for the St. Petersburg Times. And I think that goes to the question, you know, it's sometimes said, well, young people won't read print. I think the question is, well, what kind of print? I see young people with magazines all the time. I see young people with TBT when we, on college campuses in places in the Tampa Bay region. So I think it's not that simple. And if we're creative, if we give it as much attention to the creative process in print as we do to all the creative things we're doing on the web, well, let's just see whether print, what kind of audience print
So
can
it's
find.
still in a transition and nothing is so decided. Let me ask you another aspect that's changed with the web in journalism. You have reporters who write the articles for the paper, but they're also blogging. And so the wall that used to be more firm between fact and news and opinion is really blurry. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're exactly right that it's the demands on journalists have increased tremendously in terms of how frequently they write, where they publish, how quickly they publish. When I started, it was a once-a-day rhythm. The journalists working in our newsroom today, Adam Smith, the political reporter, is tweeting and blogging and writing for the next day's paper sort of around the clock. It's very much like a wire service. And what I think that does, not so much in the question of between fact and opinion, at least in our case, but in terms of how much review does something get before it's published. You know, in the old days, and still today, if it's going into print, some journalism would pass under the eyes of 3 or 4 different editors. If Adam is tweeting breaking news, that goes directly to the audience. Fortunately, we have good journalists and they understand what the boundaries are, but you're right that there's not nearly as much review before publication digitally as there has been in print. And I would say the profession is still working its way through that.
I would imagine too, with the cutbacks and downsizing, that's another aspect that you can't always review things as quickly as things come around.
That is one of the questions that's coming up as well. How much review does something need before it is published? What are the protocols? What should a reporter break immediately? What should the reporter hold for the next day's paper? Who needs to see it before it goes out? Those are all fascinating questions, and they're very much under review.
What are some of the major changes that you've implemented in the last 2 to 3 years?
Well, I would say obviously we're doing quite a lot more digitally. It's not just what we are doing, it's how the world is changing around us and how we are responding to it. That's one. Second, the recession has been of huge consequence for every business, so that has forced us to sharpen our choices about what we are going to do and what we are not going to do, and to be even more clear about what readers and to some extent advertisers place huge value on. And then I would say the third thing that we've done that I think has really been groundbreaking that way is to put down some big bets on a few things that we think have a lot of promise, including PolitiFact.
Would you talk a little bit about the mission and how that came about?
I think PolitiFact is a new way to do one of the most fundamental assignments of journalism, and that is to check up on whether politicians are keeping their promises and telling the truth.
With your truth-o-meter.
With our truth-o-meter. PolitiFact was the brainchild of Bill Adair, our Washington bureau chief, who came to us one day and said, you know, as we come up on the next election cycle, I really don't want to do it the old way. I don't want to, you know, cover the speeches that the candidates make and then go ask their opponents what they think about that and have just the back and forth. There'll be a lot of that. We can get that from other places. What I think we should do is to come up with a way to tell whether the politicians are telling the truth. And so we did create PolitiFact. It's a web-based site, politifact.com. But it also appears very much in print, and it goes to the question of whether politicians' statements are true. And it's not as easy as it might sound, but we devote considerable resource to it. We have partners now in 8 other states, and PolitiFact has really caught some traction because it does respond to people's interest. What is happening? Is what I'm told true? How can I, as an educated, interested voter, sort out the truth from fiction? And so we give political statements different ratings on our truth-o-meter, from true all the way down to pants on fire if it's a real whopper.
With PolitiFact, is that to a certain niche, which is, you know, a targeted smaller audience? Your paper has more of a broader general appeal. Was this an effort to do a niche publication?
Well, I think it does very much try to reach people who are politically interested and aware. I think that's a very large segment of our audience.
So much broader than just a, yes.
But I think it is. I think it's interesting. It's often entertaining and lively, and I think it goes to show that you don't have to be dull to do important work.
For any of our viewers who don't read a newspaper, give me 2 or 3 top reasons why they should.
Well, your life is always more interesting if you know what's going on. You know, if you try to go through life in your community without knowing what's happening in business or politics or government, you're not going to really enjoy living in your community as much. Second, from a self-interested standpoint, as a consumer, there's terrific information in a newspaper about how to get better deals, where to take your kids after school, what kind of events might be going on this weekend. So I think all of those, now many of those are on the web, they usually start in a newspaper, so I think how to get more out of your own life is a central benefit of newspaper reading, in addition to the one about just being a more informed and effective member of your community.
What would you tell one of our UCF students if they were potentially considering newspaper as a career? How would you counsel them today?
I would always tell young people, do what you love. Because if you do what you love and you're good at it, there will always be a role for you. The skills that young people need coming into the newspaper business today are different than the skills that I needed when I went into the newspaper business. And they have to do some things that, frankly, I cannot personally do these days. But the essential skills of being curious about the world around you, going out, understanding how to find out information, how to find out things that people don't want you to know, and tell your audience something that they want to know is still the enduring journalistic skill.
Paul, thank you so much. There's so many more questions that we just can't get to, but thank you for being on the show.
It's been my pleasure.
I've been talking with Paul Tash, CEO and Chairman of Times Publishing Company. We'd like to know your thoughts on media and news and its importance to society and the economy. Please share your views on our website. I'm Diane Trees. Thank you for joining me on UCF Metro Center Outlook.
This program was made possible by funding from the Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies, where government leaders, business executives, and academic experts come together to discuss major issues facing the state of Florida.